Hey everyone, this is Darshan again, coming in to talk about philosophy and ethics and how this all comes together. I have with me a guest today, and the guest is Ku. Hey Ku.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Ku is a friend, but he's actually as he puts it, a professional contrarian. He's an attorney. He's a philosophy guy. He's an ethicist, and we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the principles we discussed before. We talked about the Belmont principles. We talked about beneficence, non-malfeasance, justice, and respect. But we didn't discuss some of the other basic underpinnings of these types of thoughts. So, Ku, would you like to talk a little bit about why it's important to discuss these underpinnings?
Sure. In a lot of the discussions, there are, for example, the Belmont principles, there are ways to look at things, but there are things behind the doors, as it were, that allows you to think about why we have these rules, and how we use it in terms of what happens when the manual runs out, right?
Right.
Like difficult questions that we hadn't thought of before, and we should be equipped with how to think about that. And really, the place to go, in my mind, is the more fundamental reasons why we created these rules, or the pillars, or the principles.
Excellent. So what are some of these more fundamental principles, if you will?
Yeah, so at least when I was a student, we used to think about it in this sort of 2.5 buckets of thoughts.
We're going to come back to ask which one's the half bucket, right?
Yes, of course. It's the 5-piece. I'm just kidding. So on the first hand is sort of what I like to call it a sort of prescriptive model. This is where an outside authority has decided the right and wrong.
Yeah.
And then there's, of course, gray areas of questions in the middle.
So is that like the government basically deciding?
It could be government, it could be your religious leaders, it could be, ethicists. But there are clear not clear, but the rules are written, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So would the Belmont principles fall into that?
I don't think so. I think that it's much more of a weighing, but of course, by the time you get to the obvious questions, it almost seems like the ethical rules have been written, right? So, I would imagine that sometimes it feels that way and sometimes it doesn't. And now, very related sort of way of looking at it that is close to it is oftentimes called the rights theory, or other names to it. But what that way of looking at it is trying to do is to determine some of the principles by which we want to look at a situation to figure out whether it's moral or immoral. And you look at all the sort of your cultural baggages, your surrounding circumstances, but you're trying to come to a clear moral picture of what that is at the end of the day.
What does cultural baggages mean here?
I used to really like talking about it when I taught undergrad class in this, was what happens if I, harm a puppy. It's not illegal, but it looks terrible, is immoral as an act, right?
Okay.
So that kind of things. That in some cultures, perhaps that's not as much of a question,
right,
one way or the other.
Right.
Right, so that's something like that would be in play. So then you're trying to find these principles, and then you're trying to apply its sort of fit and weight to how you think about the solutions.
Is that a nice way of saying contextualizing the information?
Somewhat, and I don't want to make it sound like it's a very relativistic way of looking at the world. What it is that people really like the smart people who study this stuff really like to think of it like a almost like a scientific discovery. So we discover these principles as we improve on how we think about the rights. And these principles we start discovering, we used to think that a certain act was normal, now we think they're immoral.
Right.
So that there's a evolution of our thoughts and morals as well.
So what may be immoral, unethical at a previous time may be okay now.
I suppose you can go the other way too, right?
And or
right.
Absolutely. And I guess we spoke the last time around, and I know you heard the podcast or the video cast, but generally speaking, we talked about Nazi prison experiments.
Yeah.
And we talked about how that was unethical. And now we've worked to change that. Is it possible to look at the Nazi prison experiments under the rights theory and go, in that period of time when there were no rules, it was potentially, maybe morally, in some context, okay, but obviously looking back, obviously it wasn't.
I think that this, 70, 80 years it's been, I'm not sure that I think that one of the biggest issues you were talking about, and I would go to as well, is the agency of the test subjects.
Okay.
And I don't think that that would have been overlooked.
Okay.
Right, even 80 years ago or 70 years ago. So that's a pretty fundamental view in human rights, or the rights that we think of, that we possess, not to be coerced into these situations. So, but the more interesting question might be to determine whether or not it is ethical today to use technologies that were developed by ill-gotten means, whether it's the Nazi scientists or so then you have to think about how do you think about that and how that gets used, because now the genie's out of the bottle, right? We have the technology.
Right.
Do you then use it for a betterment, or do you say this was a terrible mistake we made, let's lock it up? Is that even possible?
Right.
So you got to be smart about that.
And do you then land up ignoring the sacrifice that those individuals made for us to actually even have the technology? And that gets weightier, if you will. But you said there were three different theories. So the first one was one was the rights theory. Right. The first one was the prescriptive theory, if you will. What's the third one?
So then the last view of it is the what's really commonly understood, or in its correct name, is utilitarian sort of theory of it, where sort of the catch-all motto might be the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But these theories all maybe have criticisms that are very valid. And for example, your rights or theory, or the prescriptive theory, you get into this idea of.
I'm sorry, is this the rights theory or the prescriptive theory we're thinking of right now?
Well, it's similar in the criticism is, but in trying to discover the perfect answer, oftentimes you think of good answer as bad answer. You get into, and then you end up with, are we going to do anything to better the sufferings of the people, for example, or are we just going to sit there and think about the perfect answer, right? So that's criticism. In terms of utilitarianism, you have the question of, well, what is utility? How do you measure it? There's utility monsters problems. So to you and me, someone came and said, here's $1,000, we'd be ecstatic. But for Warren Buffett, for example, we give himself $1,000, the guy probably wouldn't be that excited about that $1,000.
Right.
So that $1,000, even though it gets us the same thing in the world, has a different utility to people like you and me versus other people with different bases.
Does that go to the core question of informed consent then?
It can, of course, yes, if you look at it that way. So measuring utility is difficult, and also what it is difficult. And then you have this sort of boundary issues of people who have nothing, people who have everything, and then everybody in between.
Fascinating. We're going to land up exploring a lot of these as we continue, but cool. Thank you again for coming in to talking to us, and I'm looking forward to having you on again.
Of course.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or the show's website at darshantalks.com.